It was just another quiet Thursday evening in Portland. The kind of evening where the sidewalks are still damp from a light drizzle and the scent of wet pine lingers in the air. The sky, painted with strokes of gold and gray, stretched low over rows of modest homes with manicured lawns. Darren Lewis, a 38-year-old school counselor, had just ended his final online session with a student struggling in algebra. He sighed, stood up from his desk, and called out to his dog, Milo, a friendly golden retriever with a habit of barking at squirrels. Like every evening, Darren slipped on his hoodie, clipped the leash to Milo's collar, and stepped out for a walk. Same block, same path, same streets he had walked for the last 3 years since moving into the neighborhood. He nodded at a neighbor across the street. The man didn't nod back. He passed by a couple tending to their garden. The woman subtly tugged her husband's arm, whispered something, and glanced at Darren as if he didn't belong. He noticed. He always did, but he said nothing, because this was normal. When you're a tall black man in a mostly white neighborhood, suspicion becomes a silent companion. You feel it in glances, in the pause before someone responds to your hello, in the way conversations stop when you walk into a store. But that evening, something was off. Milo growled softly near the corner. A shadow moved behind a curtain across the street. Someone was watching. Moments later, a black SUV crept by. Darren looked up. The driver, a woman in her 50s, stared hard, one hand on the wheel, the other clutching her phone. He didn't know it then, but she had just dialed 911. She reported a large black male walking slowly, looking into homes. That's all it took. 12 minutes later, Darren would be face down on the pavement, bleeding, cuffed, accused. His only crime? Walking his dog. But this story doesn't end there. Because hanging from Milo's neck, nearly hidden beneath his golden fur, was a small GoPro camera. A gift from Darren's nephew, who loved filming everything. A camera that just happened to be rolling. It captured everything. The confrontation, the words, the violence. And soon, the whole city would see what really happened on that quiet street, when a man walked his dog, and the world decided he didn't belong. Before the headlines, before the protest signs, before the city knew his name, Darren Lewis was invisible to most. Not because he was quiet, but because people chose not to see him. Darren was 38 years old, a school counselor at Roosevelt High in Northeast Portland. His days were spent helping teenagers survive high school, survive broken homes, survive a world that rarely gave them the benefit of the doubt. He had a gift, the kind of calm that made anxious kids breathe easier, a voice steady like a lighthouse in the storm. His students said, "Mr. Lewis doesn't talk over you, he talks to you." Outside of school, Darren lived alone. No wife, no kids, just him and Milo, a golden retriever rescue with a bark way too big for his body. Darren's home was modest. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a small backyard where Milo chased bees and barked at passing mail trucks. On weekends, Darren mowed the lawn while listening to old-school jazz, his mind drifting between lesson plans and memories of home. He was born and raised in New Orleans, the youngest of 3, raised by a single mother who worked night shifts at the ER and came home smelling of rubbing alcohol and lavender. She raised Darren with one rule: don't let them decide who you are. That rule followed him to Portland, a city known for its rain, coffee, and progressive slogans. But beneath the surface, Darren noticed the gap between what people said and what they actually did. He bought his house in a changing neighborhood. You know the kind, the one with freshly painted murals and rising rent, where yoga studios replaced laundromats and where black residents became fewer each year. Darren became one of the only black homeowners on the block. Some neighbors welcomed him with polite hellos and small talk about the weather. Others kept their distance, no eye contact, quick glances through drawn curtains. At first he brushed it off, told himself not to overthink it, but you can only ignore so much before the silence starts to feel like shouting. So he created a rhythm: early mornings at the gym, Hours at school, quiet dinners at home, and evening walks with Milo. That walk became sacred not because it was special, but because it was his chance to breathe, to stretch, to reclaim space that never really felt like his in the daylight. And Milo? He was more than a dog. He was Darren's reason to keep moving, a goofy four-legged shadow that wagged his tail even on the worst days. That's why Darren kept walking, even when the stairs lasted too long, even when a woman crossed the street instead of passing him, even when a parked police cruiser suddenly pulled away and circled the block again, because routine felt like resistance, because silence had never saved anyone. And on that Thursday night, Darren stepped outside like always, hoodie zipped, leash in hand, Milo wagging excitedly at his side. What he didn't know was that someone was watching. What he couldn't, it was the call already being made. What he couldn't see was how quickly everything was about to change. Darren stepped out onto the sidewalk just as the sun began to dip beneath the roofs of the neighborhood. Portland evenings were cool in the spring, the air scented with lilac and the fading warmth of the day. He tugged his hoodie tighter and clicked his tongue. Milo trotted beside him, leash swinging, tail wagging, unaware that tonight was anything different. To Darren, it wasn't. Not yet. They took their usual route, down Maynard Street, past the red house with wind chimes and the old elm that leaned like it was whispering secrets to the sidewalk. Darren nodded to Mr. Holloway, who was tending to his roses. Mr. Holloway nodded back, distant but polite, as always. Then they reached Elmridge Avenue. A wider street, cleaner, newer, richer, the kind of place with Range Rovers in driveways and security signs and flower beds. Darren walked a little straighter here, not afraid, just aware, fully aware. A porch light flicked on. He didn't flinch, just kept walking. The woman at the window tilted the blinds with 2 fingers, just enough to see, just enough to judge. Milo paused to sniff a mailbox post. Darren waited. He could feel it now, the weight of eyes, of assumptions, of stories being written in real time about who he was and why he was there. Just a band walking his dog, but not really. He crossed the street partly to avoid a sprinkler, partly to make himself less of a target. But the narrative had already begun. Across town, a 911 operator answered the call. There's a large black man walking slowly down Elmridge. He's looking at houses. I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. Back on the street, Darren reached into his pocket for a poop bag, bent to clean up after Milo. When he stood up, a police cruiser rolled around the corner. He saw it, felt it. I didn't panic, just kept walking. But the cruiser slowed, just a little, just enough. The lights weren't flashing, not yet, the windows were up, but he could see them inside, 2 officers, watching. He nodded politely as they passed. No response. A minute later, he heard the engine again. The cruiser had circled the block. Now it was behind him. Milo wagged, clueless. Darren tightened his grip on the leash. Still walking. The cruiser crept closer. Then, "Excuse me, sir." Darren stopped, turned, calm. "Yes, officer?" The cop stepped out, hand resting on his belt. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. You mind telling us what you're doing here?" Darren looked the officer in the eyes. "Talking my dog. Same route I take every evening." The second officer joined, arms crossed. "Hello? You live around here?" "I do. 412 Maynard." The first officer tilted his head. "Got ID?" Darren hesitated, not because he didn't have it, but because he knew the weight of this moment. "I do," he said slowly. "But have I done something wrong?" The second officer narrowed his eyes. "You fit a description." Darren's jaw tightened. "Of what?" The first officer shrugged. "We're just following up. You mind showing that ID now?" Darren nodded. He slowly reached into his back pocket with exaggerated clarity. No sudden movements, no misunderstandings. He handed over his license. The officers looked at it. Too long, longer than needed. Then one said, "Mind if we ask you a few more questions?" Darren inhaled. "Here, am I being detained?" "Not yet." That word again, not yet. A pause. The street was silent, except for the sound of Milo sniffing a bush. Then, a change. One officer stepped closer. "What's in your pockets, sir?" Darren blinked. Fun. A dog whistle, a bag of treats. "You mind emptying them for us?" Darren looked around. There were no witnesses, no phones recording, not yet. He felt it again. That edge. That familiar edge between dignity and danger. "Officers," he said evenly. "I'm not resisting, but I'd like to know the reason for this." That was enough. The taller one stepped forward. "Because you don't belong here." The words hung in the air. Heavy. Final. The short officer flinched, as if the line had gone too far, but no one corrected it. Darren stood taller. "I told you. I live here." "And I told you," the cop snapped back. "You fit a description." The tension was no longer subtle. It thickened the air, made Darren's breath come slower. Milo barked. Once, then stopped. "Sir, we're going to need you to sit on the curb." Darren didn't move. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Do it now." The order struck like a hammer. Darren looked down at Milo, then back at the officers. He said. As he did, one officer stepped behind him. The other hovered. He could feel it. The power imbalance. The way they loomed. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes stared straight ahead. Then, a hand on his shoulder. "Don't move." Milo whimpered. Darren didn't speak. He didn't resist. And still, the cuffs came out. Cold, tight, sudden. And in that moment, on a quiet street, under a dusky sky, with his dog whining beside him, Darren Lewis became a suspect. Not because of what he did, but because of what they chose to see. Darren sat still, the weight of the handcuffs sinking into his wrists like manacles forged by decades of injustice. The leash to Milo, still gripped in one hand, was now taut. The dog stood close, tail tucked, eyes darting, sensing what Darren had known all along. This wasn't about safety, this was about control. One officer loomed over him, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though the sun had already dipped behind the rooftops. The other paced, hand never straying far from the baton on his belt. Darren kept his eyes forward. He didn't dare blink too long. Every move he made was a test. Every breath had weight. He wasn't just being questioned. He was being measured, sized up, diminished. And all for the crime of being seen. A walk, a hoodie, a slow glance at a lawn, a black man out of place, and suddenly the world tipped sideways. "You always walk this dog around here?" the pacing officer asked, voice sharp and empty of curiosity. Darren responded evenly. "Every night, since I moved in 3 years ago." "You got any prior arrests, Darren?" the other one asked. Not Mr. Lewis, not Sir, just Darren, like they already owned him. "No," he said quietly. "You sure about that?" Darren met the man's eyes. "Check out." There was a pause. The pacing stopped. "And then you sound a little too confident for someone in cuffs." "Because I didn't do anything." The standing officer moved closer. "Then why do you look so nervous?" "Because this isn't the first time something like this has happened," Darren said. And that's when the shift happened. The line crossed. "You people always got an excuse," the officer muttered. "Always a victim." Darren's pulse quickened. "I just want to go home." "You'll go when we say you go." Silence thickened. Milo whimpered softly. "You know," the pacing officer continued, "we had a break-in a few streets over. Big guy, dark hoodie, fits your profile." Darren scoffed. "That's not a description, that's a stereotype." The officer stepped in close enough for Darren to smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You calling me racist?" "I'm calling it what it looks like." In a flash, the baton was out, not swinging, not yet, but drawn, raised like a threat, like punctuation to the words they hadn't yet spoken aloud. "Let's take him in," the other said. "Let him explain it at the station." "For what?" Darren asked. "For walking?" "For being suspicious," came the reply. "For being mouthy. You don't get to decide that." But they already had. The taller officer yanked Darren to his feet by the elbow. Milo barked and jumped, confused, his paws scraping against the concrete. One officer kicked toward the dog, just missed. Darren flinched. "Leave him alone," Darren shouted, panic finally slipping through his tone. "Control your animal," the other officer snapped. "He's on a leash. You're the ones escalating." They didn't care. The shove came hard. Darren stumbled, nearly falling, but when he caught himself, when he raised his hands again, he was met with a punch to the ribs. Pain exploded across his side. And that was when the camera started rolling. Across the street, a boy, 16, maybe 17, stood on the front steps of his home, phone out. Camera steady. "I'm recording," he said, voice loud and clear. The officers froze for half a beat. But only a beat. "Put that away, kid," one barked. "You're assaulting him for walking home," the boy replied. The officers turned, defensive, postures shifting, but the damage was done. Darren, doubled over in pain, glanced up and saw the boy and saw the light on the phone. And for the first time since the cuffs had gone on, something inside him stirred. Not hope exactly, but possibility. Someone saw him, really saw him, not as a threat, but as a man. Darren sat in the back of the patrol car, his hands still cuffed, his ribs aching from the blows. Milo had been taken by a neighbor, he hoped. He hadn't seen his dog since the officers pushed him into the cruiser. The interior smelled of plastic and sweat. His thoughts raced, heart pounding not from fear, but from rage barely held back by discipline. He had been here before, not in cuffs, not beaten, but in this exact state of mind. Betrayed, disrespected, dehumanized. But this time, someone had seen it. Someone had filmed it. The boy. That changed everything. As the car rolled through the streets, Darren glanced at the quiet houses outside. Somewhere behind those windows, people were checking their phones, already seeing the video. The damage was done. No turning back. At the station, the mood had shifted. The laughter that usually greeted new arrests was absent. Officers moved stiffly. Some avoided eye contact. Others glanced at him, then quickly looked away. They knew. They had seen it too. The video was already circulating. As he sat alone in the holding cell, bruises spreading across his back and arms, Darren leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't feel relief yet, only pressure building. Something had started, and now he had to see it through. Across town, the video had exploded online. Within an hour, justice for Darren was trending. Activists reposted it. News outlets picked it up. Civil rights lawyers called for action. Lisa Tanner, the journalist who had once reported on housing discrimination in the city, watched the clip over and over again. Her jaw clenched. She recognized him. She remembered the story he told her 2 years ago, off the record. A story about being followed home, about always looking over his shoulder, about knowing that one day it might not end with just words. Lisa grabbed her phone and dialed. "Darren Lewis just got arrested, brutalized. It was caught on camera. I need a full team, now." By morning, her story was live. The footage played across television screens, in YouTube thumbnails, on Instagram stories and TikToks. Darren's face, bloodied, pressed into the pavement, was burned into the public consciousness. And the people responded. By noon, protesters had gathered in front of the precinct. Some held signs. Others simply stood in silence, their presence a statement. Among them was the boy who had recorded it. He hadn't said much. He didn't need to. Darren, now sitting across from his lawyer in a gray-walled conference room, listened as she laid out the situation. "They want this to blow over," she said. "They think if they keep you in long enough, People will forget. Darren shook his head, slowly. Let them try. She smiled, but her voice remained firm. We have the footage. The pressure is building. This won't stay quiet, not this time. Darren looked down at his bruised knuckles. This wasn't over, not even close. But this time, he wasn't the only one fighting. Darren sat in silence on the back porch of his apartment, the early morning sun casting golden light over the rooftops of Harlem. Milo lay beside him, his head resting gently on Darren's foot, as if reminding him that even after chaos, there is still peace to be found. He held a cup of black coffee, but didn't drink it. His mind was still replaying the night before, every voice, every accusation, every moment of fear. And then the boy with the phone. That single act that cracked open a system of silence. The charges were dropped. The department reviewed the body cam footage and found insufficient cause for the arrest. Of course they did, but not a single apology, not even a phone call, just a void of cold bureaucracy and a quiet expectation that he'd move on. But how do you move on from being dehumanized? How do you forget the knee in your back, the concrete against your cheek, the sound of your own dog whimpering because he doesn't understand why his person is being hurt? Darren took a long breath. He didn't want vengeance. He wanted change. He wanted Milo to grow up in a world where a leash wasn't a trigger, where a man's presence in his own neighborhood didn't warrant suspicion, where walking while black wasn't a threat, but just walking. His phone buzzed. A message from a local reporter. We'd still love to run your side of the story. He stared at the screen. Part of him wanted to delete it, to retreat, to disappear, to not become another symbol, another hashtag. But another part of him, stronger now, remembered the kid who spoke up, who held his phone up not as a weapon, but as a shield of truth. Maybe telling the story wasn't just about him anymore. Maybe it was about making sure the next Darren didn't have to live the same moment. He opened his laptop. Typed. My name is Darren. I'm a vet, a dog dad, and a black man. Last night, I was arrested for walking my dog. He didn't know what would come next. But he knew this. He wasn't walking alone anymore.